Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Carl Sauvant, Resident Senior Fellow at the Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment of Columbia University. It's a pleasure for me to be here today with you via video. I'm sorry I'm not here in person. To talk with you about defining and understanding sustainable foreign direct investment. I think the best way to begin is by putting this topic into context, and specifically the context of attracting foreign direct investment. The starting point for us is that all countries seek to attract foreign direct investment. The reason is that the tangible and intangible resources and assets associated with foreign direct investment can make a contribution to the economic and social development of host countries. Of course, foreign direct investment has all sorts of downsides as well, like crowding out domestic enterprises and what have you. But on balance, it is clear that all countries think that foreign direct investment can make a contribution to development, that it is important for development, and accordingly seek to attract it. Now, when it comes to attracting foreign direct investment, I think one can distinguish at least 3 generations of investment promotion strategies aimed at attracting foreign direct investment. The first one is that countries simply liberalize their foreign investment frameworks in order to open up for foreign direct investment, and many countries continue to do that in various ways and through various means. The second generation is a more active approach, namely seeking actively to promote foreign direct investment, seeking actively to attract foreign direct investment, but in a very general manner. So by, for instance, simply saying, come to country X because it is a very good investment location. And the third generation continues to do what the country has done in the first and second generation, but it moves on to target specifically foreign direct investment in light of a country's developmental priorities. Now, one type of targeting foreign direct investment, or one type of foreign direct investment that can be targeted, is sustainable foreign direct investment. And that brings me to the core of my presentation, namely defining and understanding sustainable foreign direct investment, which is, in a sense, a part of the third generation of attracting strategies, namely to attract sustainable foreign direct investment. This raises immediately the question of how to define sustainable foreign direct investment. Here is my definition: economically viable investment that makes a maximum contribution to the economic and social and environmental development of host countries and takes place in the framework of fair governance mechanisms. This is a definition that goes beyond do no harm and calls for active efforts on the part of investors to contribute to the sustainable development of their host countries. In other words, sustainable foreign direct investment for sustainable development. But this raises another question. I mean, how do you identify the characteristics that are associated with foreign direct investment that makes a maximum contribution to the economic, social, and environmental development of host countries and takes place in the framework of fair governance mechanisms? The approach that Howard Mann and myself have taken to answer this question is to look at the one hand, what governments say they expect foreign investors to contribute to the economic development of host countries, to their countries, and on the other hand, to look at what investors say they contribute to the sustainable economic development of their host countries. The underlying assumption, of course, of this approach is that regardless of what academic or other experts say, the principal actors in the relationship between foreign investors and host countries know best what is good for them in the case of governments and what they can contribute in the case of investors. Accordingly, we have to look at a wide range of instruments, ranging from international investment agreements to industry codes to CSR, to corporate social responsibility statements of firms to determine what governments expect from investors and to see what investors say they can contribute to the development of host countries. We call the characteristics that make foreign direct investment especially desirable FDI sustainability characteristics. So FDI sustainability characteristics are characteristics of foreign direct investment that make an investment particularly desirable to host countries. Let me give you a few examples for both, no, for each of the four dimensions of sustainable FDI as contained in the definition, namely economic, social, and environmental development and fair governance. A full list is available in the handout which you should have. So within the economic dimension, for example, local linkages have been identified by governments, but also by investors as something that is very desirable. And we know that linkages are particularly important in terms of helping to transfer the tangible and intangible assets that foreign investors have to domestic enterprises and to the host countries. So that is an important sustainability characteristic. But you can extend that to being included in supply chains, in other words, in linking to global supply chains, which, as you know, are really one of the defining characteristics of the world economy today and help countries in particular to break into international markets. So that's an example of a sustainability characteristic in the economic dimension. In the environmental dimension, one could mention, just to give you one example, the issue or the challenge for foreign affiliates increasingly to have low carbon footprints. And one could obviously encourage enterprises to move in that direction, and perhaps one could even think about encouraging enterprises to move, or in affiliates, to move to be CO2 neutral in their operations in host countries. So that's the environment, it's an example for the environmental dimension. In this social dimension, I think perhaps one of the best examples is to respect labor rights and workplace safety. Very basic attributes of any investment that ought to be considered and ought to be pursued and observed by investors. And finally, in the area of governance, the governance dimension of the definition of sustainable foreign direct investment, you have the question of stakeholder engagement, in particular important in the case of large projects, particular mining projects or agricultural projects, where it is important to make sure that stakeholders affected by the investment are fully consulted and involved. But it also moves to, it also includes other important aspects of governance. Again, in particular in the case of big projects, the question of negotiating fair contracts. Contracts that between the host government and foreign investors that are as fair as possible for the host countries. And of course, that implies all sorts of things as far as the bargaining position of host countries are concerned and the capacity they need to negotiate with international investors. So these are examples for each of the dimension of sustainable foreign direct investment. And as I mentioned already, a full list of sustainability characteristics that has been culled from relevant instruments is available to you. Now, what is important here is that there is in fact a substantial overlap between the qualities that governments seek in foreign direct investment and the qualities investors say they bring to host countries to advance sustainable development. In fact, one could even go so far as to speak about an emerging consensus between governments and investors, international investors, as to various FDI sustainability characteristics. And the result is an indicative list of FDI sustainability characteristics that provides governments, and for that matter, investors that are interested in seeking to increase the contribution of foreign direct investment to sustainable development. The fact that there is broad agreement between governments and investors as to what type of foreign direct investment contributes most to development should make it easier for governments to encourage foreign investors to contribute as much as possible to their host country's sustainable development. Now, this raises another important question, namely how to encourage foreign investors to make, in fact, the greatest possible contribution to development, while still remaining commercially viable, of course. In other words, what incentives could be created in this respect? Let me outline an idea that might be worthwhile exploring, namely to create a special category of authorized sustainable investor. It is an approach that Evan Gabor and I suggested, and that had a precedent in the trade facilitation agreement of the WTO, which created a category of authorized operator. It is not only a precedent, but also a model for motivating best practice use in trade. Under the trade facilitation agreement, members may provide additional facilitation benefits to operators who meet certain criteria, including having a record of customs compliance, financial solvency, or supply chain security. The benefits include reduced documentation requirements, deferred taxes, and a single custom declaration. So the idea is to do something similar in the investment area by creating a category of authorized sustainable investor. It would similarly entitle qualified international investors to investment facilitation benefits that go beyond those available to all investors. Constructing such an analog presents, of course, challenges, including what would be qualifying criteria that can be reasonably be monitored, and what could be additional benefits that would make it worthwhile for investors to seek the status of authorized sustainable investor. Our approach contains three main parts. The first one is to establish certain basic criteria. In other words, investors would have to meet certain basic criteria to qualify, no matter in which host country they are established. Importantly, they would have to commit to observe certain internationally recognized guidelines, and a number of investors have already done so, especially the ILO Declaration on Multinational Enterprises, the United Nations Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights, and the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. Additional, we could of course think about adding additional requirements, such as making CSR, corporate social responsibility statements, available and report on their progress and disseminate them widely, or to show a compliance with local laws. The purpose of these basic requirements is to ensure that investors accept internationally recognized norms and show a history of responsible business behavior in their operation. So that would be the first category, the first qualifying set of criteria, the basic set of criteria. A second set of criteria could be country-specific, in other words, tailored to the specific needs of each individual country. And investors would have to commit themselves to use reasonable best efforts to ensure that their investments fulfill certain FDI sustainability characteristics established by host countries. Such a standard would focus on investors' efforts to fill commitments rather than requiring countries to monitor whether investors meet certain metrics for each characteristics. So one could, of course, imagine that each country could develop its own list of sustainability characteristics, but that list could be guided by a general indicative list of FDI sustainability characteristics. And I have mentioned before already that we have established such an indicative list. And again, by way of example, the list could include commitments, for example, to create backward linkages, to engage in community development, to reduce the carbon footprint, to follow proper resource management practices, to use non-discriminatory hiring practices, observe human rights, to maintain supply chain standards, and to engage with stakeholders through stakeholder consultations. As discussed earlier, these are all contributions to host country development that many governments seek and many investors say they make. Allowing countries to indicate the sustainability characteristics that qualify investors as sustainable ensures that the additional benefits target those investors whose investments likely support specific countries' development goals. So they are meant to be of particular interest to the host countries, to specific host countries involved. At the same time, investors have the flexibility to choose those characteristics most appropriate to them. So thirdly, what are the additional benefits? Once investors meet the basic and country-specific requirements, they would qualify for additional benefits beyond those generally available to all investors. And such benefits could include just by way of example, access to a dedicated sustainable investor focal point within the investment promotion agencies, the countries involved, who works exclusively with the authorized sustainable investor. It could also include priority assistance to authorized sustainable investors, and perhaps reduced fees and other charges in meeting establishment requirements. It could include providing exclusive employee training for specific needs of the foreign investors. Could include helping foreign affiliates to establish linkages through specific targeted linkages programs available to these investors. And of course, it includes various financial and fiscal incentives. We could also think about some positive publicity and soft recognition benefits, like awards and easy access to high-ranking officials. Let me conclude by returning to my starting point, namely that all countries seek to attract foreign direct investment that contributes as much as possible to their sustainable development. Hence, countries ought to encourage, especially the type of foreign direct investment that makes a maximum contribution to their development, what I have termed sustainable foreign direct investment. Sustainable foreign direct investment is investment that has certain sustainability characteristics captured in an indicative list of sustainability characteristics that reflects what governments seek and companies say they would bring, or they are bringing, in the context of foreign direct investment. To encourage investors to make the best effort to engage in sustainable foreign direct investment, it would be worthwhile for countries to create the category of authorized sustainable investor that entitles these investors to certain benefits when entering and operating in a host countries, and these should be benefits that go beyond what every investor gets. I wonder which country will be the first to implement this concept and benefit from its pioneering role. Thank you very much for your attention.